morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, March 10th, 2021, and on this episode, I want to revisit a topic I covered quite a bit, especially in late 2019 and early 2020 in a bunch of episodes. That is, the problem with most places, these are generally localities that I was covering, cities, counties, and the like. The problem with them claiming to be Second Amendment sanctuaries when they're really not. Usually it's just all talk in hundreds of these. All talk and zero sanctuary. And now some legislators around the country, a growing number of them, seem to be really on board with taking this failed grandstanding strategy on a local level and then trying to apply it on a state level. I don't honestly know if they're just ignorant or they're just not aware of the technical legal process. And that happens a lot because you may support the right to keep and bear arms, but you don't understand the legal mechanisms that you can use and how to use them on a state or a local level. I'm sure there are some that just are not aware. There are others that I think are just grandstanding, lying, pretending to be good, and really just trying to scam you. So I want to go through some of that legislation that we're seeing around the country that is just garbage. It claims to be a sanctuary for a state when it really does nothing in effect, in concrete action, in practice. Now, we do also have an example when we've reached out to try to correct this. In one state, we've already seen a change and that legislation pass out of a state house already. So it's possible that we can make a difference just by providing the right information to the right people. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You're going to find all the previous episodes for over 2 years on individual episodes like today's. I usually publish the post for the episode of the day about an hour after I do the live broadcast, and you're going to find a bunch of links and references to other articles, to legislation, to previous episodes, and the like, so you can learn more on your own time. This episode specifically, there's a lot of stuff that you probably need to understand in advance that I'm not going to cover because I've done so many previous episodes, and if we do a 3-hour episode today, that is just not in the cards for me. Even if you want me to do that, not happening. Anyways, you're going to find all that information and even our membership program. I want to say a big thank you to a number of people out there who have joined us recently, just grabbing a few names off the top of my head here. There's Cheryl, Arthur, Randon, Brett, and Jeremy have joined in the last couple of days. I really appreciate you putting your financial faith behind our work. You can join us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage, again, is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say a quick hello to everyone in the live chat. While we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on this live stream, Marcus, Dixie, Israel, Tyler B., Tim, who else? Okay, so let me scroll through. Bob Landry, Clay Kent, Rachel Menard, MRGF, EHP Training. Good to see you in the morning, EHP. Justin Morrison, Blue North, Wyatt, the Chicken Man, Southern Gent, Alan Mosley. I'm going to be on Alan's show late night at the end of this month. I think we're recording on the 30th, and that will broadcast on the 31st. Leslie Ann and everyone else, Kay Ray, Grady. I appreciate you all joining me, Adam and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anybody. Please leave some comments, some thoughts on what we're talking about as I go through this today and in the archive, even if you're not joining us live, because that helps out a lot. The discussion, the feedback, the questions all help me actually learn sometimes. Like, for example, when I've done some historical episodes, I found some mistakes. People point things out like, Bolden, you're wrong about this. And I've been able to make some corrections and learn more from that as well. I also get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. Anyways, let's get right to this. And I want to start out with this. I want to recommend this episode. I've actually done 6 full episodes, probably about 3 to 4 hours worth of content throughout 2019 and early 2020 on local Second Amendment sanctuaries. And I'm going to link to one of them in the show notes that I think goes into some good detail to explain the problem with most of them. And I'm sure those of you who this is kind of a new content to you, you may have a lot of questions, but this is a good starting point. And you'll see some recommendations recommended links at the bottom of that one as well to take you elsewhere. The short version of this, hundreds of so-called Second Amendment sanctuaries have passed in localities around the country, mostly in 2019. I think there were about 100 of them in Virginia alone, and almost every single one. I haven't really found one in the past year or two that does something beyond claiming to be a Second Amendment sanctuary when they're just passing a non-binding resolution and creating a sanctuary for nothing. It's all talk. It's blowing smoke in your proverbial area, I guess. I would also make the case that doing this does more harm than good. Now, if you're just taking the position, in one of those episodes that I did back then, in late 2019, right around Christmas of that year, I talked about how non-binding resolutions can be an important part of the strategy. For example, Jefferson and Madison, their resolutions in Kentucky and Virginia against the Alien and Sedition Acts, where many of us have long thought nullification really got its start under the Constitution. These were non-binding resolutions, taking a statement of principles and putting it out there to educate people and ask for further action. John Dickinson, in his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, specifically said, Concordia res parve quisquam. We have that, as well I'm mentioning it, on our membership card, which our annual members actually get to pick up as well. It says Concordia res parve quisquam. It means small things grow great by concord. In response to the hated Townsend Act, specifically the New York Restraining Act, Dickinson recognized that at that point in time, what people could do is take a first step and pass a non-binding resolution to educate the public about what's going on. Now, if you present your non-binding sanctuary resolution as, well, we support the Second Amendment resolution, we're establishing a line in the sand telling you this is what we're on board with, this is what you're not authorized to do, and if you don't stop, we're going to follow up with this, this, and this, that can be an excellent starting point. In fact, that's the type of approach that we saw the colonists use against the British as well. They specifically, in one instance, specifically passed a resolution that was a line in the sand and said, if you don't change things, we are going to follow through on these dates with this action, with this action, with this action, and this action. And that could be a very powerful starting point to rally people to the effort, to educate the public, and do something positive. But none of these resolutions, none of these so-called Second Amendment sanctuaries have ever done this. All they ever do is claim that they're making a Second Amendment sanctuary, which, you know, if you think of the word sanctuary and you're thinking Second Amendment sanctuary, this is a safe place. But if they're really not changing anything in law or changing how their law enforcement does anything, don't do anything to address federal gun control, any of this stuff, they're not creating a Second Amendment sanctuary. They're lying to you. They're grandstanding. So I actually think this does more damage than good, because the general public, they hear from their Second Amendment, their NRA-backed local politician, someone, I'm an NRA member, I'm on board with this. Their local law enforcement saying these things, and then all of a sudden nothing changes. At some point in time, people are going to be disillusioned. If you have to keep telling them, like, look, I know you passed the Second Amendment sanctuary in 2019 and nothing has changed, and now you need to pass something else, they're going to be skeptical. And maybe my cynical side tells me that some of the people that are supposed to be our friends are doing this on purpose because they really don't want to change the status quo. Anyways, that's my short rant on local Second Amendment sanctuaries. Basically, legislation, resolutions that do nothing but claim to be something far more than what they are. Now we're seeing the same type of thing happening on a state level. I've covered a lot of positive news about state efforts to withdraw resources and support for the enforcement of federal gun control. Basically, all of it is unconstitutional, but backing out of enforcement, we recognize and we know that the ATF has a manpower problem. They only have a certain number of employees. And without the support of state and local law enforcement, state logistical support, they can't enforce all their laws on the books. So banning enforcement on the local level of federal gun control is a huge first step in bringing those to an end. It's a foundational step. It's not the end-all, be-all of everything, but Judge Andrew Napolitano a couple of years ago was looking at this type of legislation that we've been working on for many years, and he specifically said, look, if you can get a single state, actually, he was talking about, even if New Jersey, of all places, would do something like that, he said if you got a single state to do this, it would make any new federal gun control nearly impossible to enforce. And while I would certainly want 100% impossible, Nearly impossible is a huge step forward. I mean, the feds might relocate resources to one area and go heavy there for a little bit to scare people off, but it really is going to take a stand from the people to do the right thing. Anyways, I'm going to probably do an episode in the near future talking about the one thing that the most successful nullification efforts in history all have in common. I'm kind of swirling that around in my head this morning as I'm putting the notes together for this episode. If you think that's an interesting idea, please let me know in the comments or email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Now let's get into the state level legislation. I'm sorry, we're 11 minutes into this episode. We're finally digging in. But the state level legislation, I think that precursor was really important. Here in Oklahoma, we reported, I guess this was on Monday morning, Mike Meharry reported about a bill claiming to make a Second Amendment sanctuary state in Oklahoma passed a Senate committee. And he writes, and he's very nice about this, and Mike's a really good guy. And he says, but it would need further amendment to have any real effect or impact in practice. He is a professional. The guy was trained as a professional journalist, and I know back when they trained him back then, they didn't just train him to do just a bunch of trash talking. I would have taken a much more aggressive approach, and that's probably why Mike is better at this than I am. Anyway, Senate Bill 631 in Oklahoma, it specifically says in the legislation they're creating the Oklahoma Second Amendment sanctuary state. It actually passed out of the state Senate yesterday. So we reported this on Monday as coming out of the committee the previous week, and this is fast track. So this is getting a lot of support from leadership in the Oklahoma legislature to be able to move through the state Senate by a vote of 38-8. It's called the Second Amendment Sanctuary Act. Let's take a look at some of that legislation. It says, it shall be, this is the kind of the key thing of what they're saying is going to create a Second Amendment sanctuary in Oklahoma. It shall be the duty of the courts and law enforcement agencies of this state to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms within the borders of this state and to protect these rights from the infringement provided under the provisions under this act. So they list a bunch of stuff that they consider provisions, and then they say it's your duty to protect them against this. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean to a law enforcement officer on the ground? In effect, they're saying, well, you know, it's not my job to determine what's constitutional or not. And the Supreme Court hasn't said that the National Firearms Act is illegal. I mean, the NRA isn't against this, and I'm an NRA member. It doesn't actually have a concrete prohibition. It's just broad, flowery language. In essence, and Mike actually covers it this way. He says, in effect, the enactment of SB 631 in its current form would function as little more than a non-binding resolution. And in fact, a non-binding resolution talking about how the state of Oklahoma actually considers all federal acts to be unconstitutional and that it should be the duty of all agencies in the state to protect people against those prohibitions would be a good starting point. Or those restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms, our natural right, that is, not our Second Amendment rights, and that the legislature should do something to follow up. And really what they need to do, if we know what a sanctuary is in most situations, it's banning the enforcement of it. And there is no prohibition on enforcing anything. They just create this kind of generic duty type of a language. He says it lacks any specific actions that courts and law enforcement agencies must take or end to, quote, protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. As written, the proposed law creates a duty without any concrete steps to fulfill it, lacking any specific actions or prohibition on actions for police or courts to follow. It seems unlikely they will take any action at all. And I know from our own experience, when you pass something like this, they absolutely do not take any action. That's kind of a broad example. It has some nice language, but it really doesn't tell anybody to stop enforcing anything. It just creates this kind of broad duty thing. We know they've already taken an oath to the Constitution. I'm sure a lot of people on the ground or these government agents are thinking, well, you know, I've taken my oath. I've already done this, and no one's telling me that no court has told me that this is unconstitutional, so I'm going to continue participating in this federal-state joint task force on drug control and gun control, and we're going to get bad guys. So nothing will change with passage of Senate Bill 631 without amendment. Now, in that report, if you live in Oklahoma, we actually included what should be amended in the bill to give it concrete effect. Like, there's a lot of good text in there. And we specifically cite Section 2C, which needs to be removed in its entirety and replaced with the following language. If you live in Oklahoma, get the link to that in the show notes. I will include it at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty for this episode. Get that link and send it over to a state representative and ask them to introduce it as an amendment to the bill, because it's going to the state house now. So it's already passed out of the Senate. So we're actually not just complaining. It's important to complain and point out problems, but we're also trying to correct the problems when they arise. Now, here's another bill. This one's just wild to me. It's a bill, House Bill 1255, and my buddy Alan Mosley in Tennessee probably will find some sick joy in knowing how bad his state representatives are, but they are pretty awful in Tennessee. Like everywhere else, really. House Bill 1255 is claiming to make the state a Bill of Rights sanctuary state. They're not just going to do Second Amendment or First Amendment or anything. They're a sanctuary for the entire state if they pass this. And I don't know how they get the audacity to actually claim that thing, because the legislation, it just says, the General Assembly declares the following. Tennessee is a Bill of Rights sanctuary state. The Constitution of the United States must be enforced according to the plain meaning of each word. And 3, the guaranteed rights in the Constitution do not come from the federal government, cannot be taken away by the federal government. This act becomes law. That's it. That's what they're passing into law. So when you hear politicians on a local or state level talk about creating a sanctuary, and you just see it in a report and the news are talking about how bad they are and all the awful things that they're doing to create this type of a sanctuary on whatever issue, most of the time, unless you're talking cannabis or immigration, there is no concrete prohibition on anything. It's generally some kind of just nice, flowery, friendly language that does nothing. And then they can go around and tell their constituents, look, I'm trying to do this, but we're running into some other problems. They're lying. They're lying, or this one to me seems like a total liar, to be honest with you, because literally they're just making a declaration and claiming through legislation, a bill, not a resolution, House Bill 1255 by Jay Sexton and Senate Bill 791 by someone named Bowling, Senator Bowling in Tennessee. They're just claiming to do nothing, really. And here's another one in Idaho. Idaho House Bill 300 is supposedly going to create some kind of a sanctuary for small personal firearms. Nice idea in concept, but here's the prohibition on enforcement. They say, quote, no official, agent, or employee of the state of Idaho or a political subdivision thereof shall be required to assist with any action on or after the effective date of this section. First of all, I should pause there. The first problem is, shall be required to assist. No one shall be required to assist the federal government in enforcing federal gun control on these particular gun control measures, even if it's on a specific single firearm. Let's say it's just on short-barreled shotguns. Banning them from enforcement stops them from enforcing most of the time. They generally try to work around that anyways, but it makes it much more difficult. Telling them they're not required to participate in the enforcement is not a prohibition at all. It just leaves it up to their discretion. You can't be required. They can't actually have any type of requirement, maybe on a local level or anything else that forces them to help the feds enforce. But it is not a prohibition. So that's the first problem. This prohibition, it says prohibition on enforcement. If you're reading along here, you can absolutely see it claims Section 4, prohibition on enforcement. And there is no actual prohibition. It specifically says they shall not be required, not they are not authorized to or shall be prohibited from. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, so they shall not be required to assist. Even if they change that to prohibited from assisting any federal action on or after the effective date of this section, it says, if such federal action is contrary to the provisions of Idaho Code or Section 11, Article 1 of the Constitution of the State of Idaho. So, let me get to this Arkansas bill, because this is a common thing. We see this in red states all the time, where they're claiming to do something positive for the right to keep and bear arms, and they say, we're going to stop enforcement of this if it violates the state or federal constitution. Sometimes they include both. It's a big if that they include there. And we see the same type of thing here in this piece of legislation in Arkansas, House Bill 1390, which was just filed last week. And they basically say this, and I'll just read right from the text here. A local or municipal government shall not, so that's an actual prohibition. Shall not is actually, we know shall not be infringed is pretty straightforward. Shall not be infringed. There are no exceptions to shall not be infringed. There's also says shall not use or authorize the use of an asset. It is a total prohibition on the use of that asset. I'm setting aside the fact that local law enforcement government agents will try to wiggle their way around this. We know this. But technically, this is an actual prohibition on implementing or aiding in the implementation of a requirement of, that's an interesting little wrinkle there that I hadn't thought about. It's adding a requirement of an order of the President of the United States, a federal regulation, or a law enacted by the Congress that is applied to infringe on a person's right under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, deny a person a right. The Real ID Act basically says, we're not going to do these things. You're not allowed to do these things if it violates the Constitution. And I wrote this tweet for 10th Amendment Center a little while back. This kind of sums up my view on how this goes. If you tell law enforcement you can't do this if it violates the Constitution, it goes like this. Telling police to stop enforcing gun measures that, quote, violate the Constitution is like taking over a poorly run business and telling the employees, stop doing those things you're not supposed to be doing. I mean, if we're taking the position that all federal gun control is unconstitutional, we should just tell them, you're not authorized to enforce the National Firearms Act of 34, the Gun Control Act of 68, its amendments in 86, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, the bump stock ban of 2018, the NICS system, all that. You're not allowed to participate in these things. Or maybe you just want to address one at a time. Just saying, hey, if it's unconstitutional, don't do it, leaves it to the discretion of the individual agency or the individual officer. And while we would like to encourage each individual officer to follow their oath and to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, rather than just kicking and punting over to the Supreme Court or a state court to make decisions on constitutionality for them, while we would like that, and that is their duty under their oath, is to refuse to enforce things they believe to be unconstitutional, no one does that in practice. And in fact, in practice, what they generally do is they say, well, if it's supposed to be unconstitutional, I'll just, as soon as a court tells me this is unconstitutional, I will stop. Otherwise, my duty is to enforce the law, not to follow the Constitution. So that's how we summed it up in this tweet. Doing this, telling them you're not supposed to do that thing if it's unconstitutional, ensures that the employees will wait for someone to tell them exactly what to stop. So it really is it creates a circular legal argument that leads to nothing in practice. Now, we've got a really good example of being able to change this approach in Arizona. There are two pieces of legislation in the House and on the Senate, both claiming, neither of them actually say that they're making a Second Amendment sanctuary, but they're basically asserting the power of the state to withdraw from enforcement of federal gun control measures. Again, the biggest first step that a state legislature can take to bring those to an end. It's a first step, but it's very, very important. So we have two bills, one on the Senate side, one on the House side. They've both passed their respective chambers, and they both take a very different approach. They both started out with the same approach. One of them we helped, hopefully, to get changed. First of all, Senate Bill 1328. It says, pursuant to the sovereign authority of this state and Article 2, Section 3, Constitution of Arizona, an act, law, treaty, order, rule, or regulation of the U.S. government that violates Article 2, Section 26, Constitution of Arizona, or Amendment 2 of the Constitution of the United States, is null, void, and unenforceable in this state. Well, basically what they're saying is, well, if you're violating the Second Amendment, you're violating the Second Amendment. I mean, this is a circular argument that sounds nice on the surface, but when you understand how these laws play out in practice, this tells them to stop doing nothing. They say they're banned from enforcing, administering, participating in anything that violates Article 2, Section 26 of the state constitution or Amendment 2 of the Constitution for the United States. That's how they're already supposed to be acting. That's how they think they're acting already. Well, if it violated the Constitution, then a state court or a federal court would tell me, and then we would stop. So just telling them to stop doing that stuff that they're already doing doesn't actually doesn't actually change anything. It was basically the same thing with House Bill 2111. Let me see if I can get the original text. The original text said, this state will not use enforcement resources, personnel, property, etc., to enforce anything that, quote, violates Amendment 2 of the Constitution of the United States. Again, we reached out to the sponsor on Twitter, said, look, if you just tell them that they have to stop doing things if it violates it, that makes them kick the ball over to a court or wait for someone to tell them this is unconstitutional. It doesn't actually prohibit enforcement. So what that ended up happening is they changed the legislation. They changed it to, we're going to stop. No one is allowed to enforce any federal gun control measure, any federal gun measure, any federal gun restriction, regulation, anything that isn't concurrently on the books in the state of Arizona. And I covered this in more detail recently. This does not end all federal gun control in Arizona, but it stops the state from enforcing the federal end. And then in an episode that I did last week, which I guess I could link to in the show notes if I remember as I'm publishing it, I pointed out that the ATF has a very handy downloadable PDF for every single state in the union, and they list all the state codes, state regulations on gun control. So if the state stops enforcing the federal gun control and then all the gun control left is on a state level, then it becomes very clear what you have to address next. And you can just go through that ATF list and say, well, let's work on this one. Low-hanging fruit, this one should be easy. Let's repeal this, 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 this. And then you'll find out what a problem your state people are as well, as I've known all along. But this was a nice change from the sponsor and a co-sponsor. This is Leo Biasucci. I'm pronouncing that wrong, but Leo is doing a good job with House Bill 2111. And Representative Brett M. Roberts introduced the amendment to change it from, well, we got to first determine if it's unconstitutional, and then just change it to, well, we're just not going to enforce anything that's specifically federal, because we don't have to, and we can choose to opt out of that at any time. Now, I covered this in much more detail, this comparison of how these pieces of legislation play out in an episode last month, California versus Missouri, top 5 nullification strategy myths. Now, in short, I will link to that in the show notes as well. In short, what we're talking about is a difference in some just minor technical things in the text. And this difference between saying, stop enforcing this if it's unconstitutional versus stop enforcing this, which is what the immigration sanctuaries are doing. They're literally not waiting for a determination of constitutionality. They're just saying, we're not going to participate. And that has been incredibly effective to actually push back on federal immigration enforcement. Whether you like that or not, you gotta recognize that the reason people don't like it is because it is incredibly effective. But when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, there is such a resistance to actually just saying we don't want to participate. So this is the difference from the left to the right. Basically, on the one hand, you have 36 states that are defying the feds on weed and nullifying federal prohibition because they're not waiting for some court to tell them it's okay to do it. That's why we have 200 to 400, maybe 150, maybe 500. There's a bunch of immigration sanctuary cities on the books right now. We have a handful of immigration sanctuary states like California, Oregon, and elsewhere. And the number of Second Amendment sanctuaries, when it comes to states, it's 0. We're still at 0. Decades later, the first immigration sanctuary state was Oregon in 1987. We're decades behind on the right to keep and bear arms. It's time to start understanding how this strategy works and get it done. And as far as localities, I would say maybe 2, 3, maybe someone can show me 5, but Second Amendment sanctuaries basically don't exist. Again, I covered these differences in some detail in that episode last month. And of course, as I was saying about the Arizona bill, we're not just complaining. We actually are trying every time we see one of these to try to correct it. For example, there's a bill in Tennessee, House Bill 928 from a guy named Scotty Campbell, who I was looking through his posts. He looks like a strong Second Amendment kind of guy. House Bill 928, the Tennessee Second Amendment Sanctuary Act. This legislation says a law, treaty, executive order, rule, or regulation of the United States that violates the Second Amendment of the United States is null, void, and unenforceable of the state. They're basically saying if it violates the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. It's just circular legal arguments. And then the state and all political subdivisions are prohibited from using any public funds, personnel, or property to enforce, administer, etc., any of these law, orders, rules, or regulations that violate the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. So we tweeted at the sponsor, hey, Scotty, while we certainly appreciate the intention of House Bill 928 to create a Second Amendment sanctuary, without an amendment, the bill will have no effect in practice. And we specifically gave him the Section 1, B2, should be amended and removes the part that says, wait for it to be determined that it violates the Constitution before you stop enforcing, and just says we are not going to enforce any federal acts regarding a firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition that does not exist under the laws of the state. That sets a great foundation to move forward in the state of Tennessee. Mike Meharry gave some public testimony on a number of bills around the country lately. One, for example, was House Bill 62. This was actually a good kind of it's still pending. House Bill 62, a Second Amendment sanctuary type bill in Ohio. And he says this, he says, many people will focus on whether or not the state has the authority to deem a federal act constitutional. As soon as you start putting that in there, you actually get into kind of a technical legal debate, a constitutional debate that most people, it's just over their head. He says, we can have that debate, but it is irrelevant to the question at hand. The state of Ohio, and any state actually, can refuse to enforce any federal law or implement any federal program for whatever reason it chooses, or for no reason at all. You could prohibit state and local agencies from enforcing federal gun control just because it's Thursday and there's snow on the ground. You don't need a reason other than you don't want to participate. That's what the 10th Amendment is all about. The federal government has their area. The states have their area. Now, unfortunately, the federal government is so far outside of the Constitution that their area is never within the lines of the Constitution. So why even worry about that in the first place if you're just thinking philosophically? But under current law, even the Supreme Court, in their own precedent, under something called the anti-commandeering doctrine, longtime or regular listeners of this show know all about it. Anti-commandeering doctrine is a series of 5 major cases from 1842 to 2018 that basically validate James Madison's strategic advice from Federalist 46, a refusal on a state and local level, individual level, using a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's Madison's advice on how to defeat federal programs. He said specifically if a number of adjoining states took this measure, it would create a situation the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter again. His words, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, his words, he understood what it would take to defeat federal programs, even at a time when the federal government was going to be very tiny in comparison today, unrecognizable compared to the largest government in the history of the world. Today, we know that states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And the dirty little secret they don't want you to know about is that partnerships don't work very well when half the team quits, like a state or a locality. So, anti-commandeering doctrine, 1842 to 2018. The Supreme Court has backed this up and said, even if they don't strike down a federal act, they just say states cannot be required to use personnel or other resources to implement or effectuate a federal act or regulatory program. It's the federal government's duty, and that's their own thing. Too bad, you can't force them. This is called commandeering, like a pirate. The first case was Prigg versus Pennsylvania. It was a Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 case. The cornerstone, we can probably say, is Prince versus U.S. And here, this is Justice Scalia against the Brady. This is Sheriff Mack and Sheriff Jay Prince saying that they couldn't be required to help the federal government implement the Brady Gun Control Act. And he says this is what Scalia said, 1997, I believe. We held in New York that Congress cannot compel the states to enact or enforce a federal regulatory program. This was New York versus U.S. in 92. He said, today we hold that Congress cannot circumvent that prohibition by conscripting the state's officers directly. And local governments are political subdivisions of the state, so they're still state's officers according to the law and the Supreme Court. Going further, Scalia says this, the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. It matters not whether policy making is involved, and no case-by-case weighing of the burdens or benefits is necessary. Such commands are fundamentally incompatible with our constitutional system of dual sovereignty. The federal government cannot require the states to enforce their federal gun control or anything else. So they don't have to say, well, we're not going to enforce this federal gun control unless it's unconstitutional. Basically, this is them trying to say they want to keep some gun control. They're really not on board with it, or they're just clueless of how this works. I'm not sure which is which. I think in some situations, they're the bad guys. In other situations, they're grandstanding. In other situations, like what we saw House Bill 2111, very positive on the House side, bad on the Senate side, we've seen them willing to actually change it to make it effective in practice. And Meharry sums it up like this. The point is, no determination of constitutionality is necessary to invoke the anti-commandeering doctrine. State and local governments can refuse to enforce federal laws or implement federal programs, whether they are constitutional or not. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More than anything, I hope you learned something. I'll include a bunch of stuff that I'm talking about here in the links to the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I saw an interesting comment from Marcus right at the beginning. I think Wisconsin, right? He said, called the Speaker of the Assembly's office to get his view on nullification in general and some specific bills. The staffer had no clue what that was and said, the courts will handle it. And that's basically the approach that a lot of people are taking on this type of legislation. They're basically saying, well, if it's unconstitutional, we'll stop. Well, as soon as a court tells us it's unconstitutional, they're just trying to set it up for another court battle. And even if the courts were on our side, they're terrible on the Constitution as a general overview, a general overarching statement. I would say they're awful. They're more like a rubber stamp. They don't even have the time. They get like 10 to 20,000 requests for cases per year. They take maybe 80 to 150 or so, and they maybe can overturn a couple. Like, it's a numbers game. This is a bad strategy. Don't rely on the courts to protect your rights. Don't rely on part of the government to limit that same government's power. But that was a really good comment. I'm curious if you ever get anything back on that. Marcus, you might want to also send that same person a copy of our document on the anti-commandeering doctrine. Say, hey, the state actually can opt out according to the Supreme Court. What do you think about that? I'd be interested if you want to do a follow-up and see if there's any other questions here as well. T. Russell, the same Senate leadership opposed to... okay... With sleight of hand and beautiful sounding words, writes Clay Kent, the people then too late heard the unmistakable sound of the trap of tyranny slam shut around them. And this is part of why I think Second Amendment sanctuary legislation that doesn't create a sanctuary is so dangerous to the overall effort. That's why I also think it's partly on purpose. And then it becomes popular because the general public is like, okay, well, why would they lie to us about this? There's already all these other sanctuaries. It's about time. They've been doing this on immigration for so long. About time we do it on guns. Well, that's what we've been arguing. But when they do it the wrong way and it doesn't actually change things in practice, it actually will cause a lot of people to be disillusioned and think that the whole strategy is worthless. And maybe that's the goal in some ways. I'm not sure. It looks like there's some spam over on Twitch. I love it when people follow us on platforms that I don't promote much. As a quick aside, please do follow us over on Odyssey and library.tv, odyssey.com/something or other. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Basically, this is a decentralized, censorship-resistant platform. This is the #1 place we're going to be once they start enabling live streaming to ensure that we can't get kicked off no matter... They can't kick us off that platform even if they want to. It's decentralized. So if you're really concerned about tech censorship and you are sick of these kind of big companies deciding what you can say and all that stuff, just stop using them. We're going to continue doing it as much as possible as long as we can reach people, but start thinking about places like MeWe and Gab and Minds and Odyssey and other places and start trying to move over there. We're definitely posting pretty regularly on all those platforms, and we're going to continue ramping that up in the future. Adam says, as a resident of North Carolina, we suck more than Tennessee. Maybe. And you'd think some of these states would be really, really good. I've seen a lot of bad things happen in North Carolina. I was happy to see finally a really, really positive bill. It's in the House Judiciary #3, Adam. House bill, I believe it's 189, Second Amendment Preservation Act, following the Missouri model that actually would prohibit enforcement of most federal gun control, past, present, and future. So that one has been filed. I think Pittman is on this. I'm not sure who else, but it had like a good number of co-sponsors, and it's in House Judiciary Committee number 3. You can check that out on the state legislature website. So there is a positive piece of legislation there. Unfortunately, nothing positive in Tennessee. Rob Taylor, good to see you, buddy, up in Oregon. He says, we need to talk about Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance in Coos County. It failed to pass. He thought it could be better, so we need to discuss it before I refile it. Yes, I'm super busy right now, probably for another month. I'm not sure. Send me an email, Rob. I know you have the contact information. I'm very grateful for the work that you are doing up in Oregon. To actually try to create real second. Rob is actually one of the few people in the country that is leading activism efforts on the ground on a local level that actually isn't like he really wants to get something done. And a lot of times he's fighting activists, he's fighting against law enforcement, he's actually fighting against, establishment people on the state level or the local level is saying you can't do this. So this guy's doing really the yeoman's work on the ground to get it right, and is really just trying to revisit things that are not working and improve on them. And that's really what it's going to take. Unfortunately, most of the other activist groups around the country are just doing awful work, but that's another story. Anyways, again, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it educational. I hope you learned something. I hope you're fired up to take action. I hope we can get some of these bad things changed to something more positive. As a positive note, there are 15 states with good legislation that can be considered in comparison to maybe only, I don't know, what is this, 5 or 6 or 7 so far on a state level. So the good stuff is definitely outweighing the bad, but what happens when something dumb and worthless passes, that makes it more likely that a good one is going to get amended down to equal the bad one and do nothing. So they tend to get a lot of momentum, and then they get press coverage claiming to be something they're not. And then we have to do a lot of work to try to correct that in the long run, if we can even pull it off. Anyways, again, I'm rambling at this point. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. Please consider a membership if you support this work, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.